Shabbat Shalom, everyone. It's Friday again, and this time it's Parashat Pinchas. Pinchas is a chock-full parasha with lots of many different things going on, obviously starting with the story of Pinchas, continuing on from last week with the story of Baal Peor and Zimri and Cosbi, and I refer you to the story at the end of last week's parasha. Continuing on with the command to fight the Midianites and the necessary census to count how many fighting age members of the Jewish people there are in order to go out and fight the Midianites and in essence also continue and conquer the land of Israel. And moving on to Tzlofchad and his daughters and that whole story, and ending with a beautiful list of all of the different korbanot of the year, starting obviously from the day-to-day korbanot, Korban HaTamid and Shabbat and Rosh Chodesh, and moving on through all the Chagim, Shalosh Regalim, Yom Kippur, and so on and so forth. We actually read little snippets of our parasha every single Chag for Maftir. But the part that I want to focus on today is actually the census. When it comes to counting the Jewish people are a very complex family that is also a nation. And beautifully, we read in our parasha, we go through every single tribe and we mention each and every family in the tribe. For example, we start with Reuven. Reuven Bechor Israel, Bnei Reuven Chanoch, Mishpachat Chanochi, Lefalu, Mishpachat Afalui, Lechetzon, Mishpachat Achetzoni, Lekarmi, Mishpachat Karmi, and so on and so forth. We go through each and every family, and this is unique. Unlike previous times where we just mentioned this is the tribe of Yisachar or the tribe of Dan, here we actually go into smaller resolution and recognize each and every patriarch of each and every subdivision within the tribe to recognize that there are plenty of different families. And we actually see that this is in preparation, as we mentioned, of not just the conquering of the land, but also the settling of the land. As we see from the story immediately afterwards, Bnot Tzlofchad, the daughters of Tzlofchad, a specific patriarch, come forth and say, well, he's dead. And there are only girls. So who's continuing this family line? And there, God says, yes, indeed, girls also inherit. And it's a very beautiful story. We will meet Bnot Tzlofchad later on in Sefer Dvarim and Bamidbar again. But the point that I want to focus on more is the complexity of Jewish mishpachology, a term that I have great endearment for, which is the science of Jewish families. When it comes to the Jewish people as a family, as we see them in our parasha, there are all sorts of rotten apples hiding within the bushel. And yet, they make a little cameo in our parasha. If we actually start with Reuven, we find Ubnei Falu Eliav, ובני אליאב נמואל ודתן ואבירם. הוא דתן ואבירם קריאי העדה אשר היצאו על משה ועל אהרון בעדת קורח בהצותם על אדוני. ותפתח הארץ את פיה ותבלע אותם ואת קורח במות העדה באכול האשת 50 איש ויהיו לנס ובני קורח לא מתו. דתן and Aviram, even though they are the antithesis of Jewish harmony, even though they are the rebels, they are the attempted coup against Moshe Rabbeinu and the leadership, they still make it on the list. They're still mentioned. And it's not the kind of the Datan Aviram, you'll never guess what they were up to. We all know, we just read Parashat Korach not long ago, and yet we still have to make sure that they are in the Jewish family history. And we do not forget them. Similarly, going back even further into Jewish history, we find the sons of Yehuda, Bnei Yehuda, ve'onan. Vayamot ve'onan be'eretz Canaan. Even though, and this throws us back to the story of Yehuda and Tamar in Bereshit, and his sons who sinned against God and were killed, famously the husbands of Tamar, we mention them. Even though we're generations ahead, we're even the generation after the generation that left Egypt. We are no longer the people of the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim. We're their children, and yet we're still throwing back the Sefer Bereshit, still throwing back to Yehuda and Tamar and ve'onan. Why? This connects very much to something that's been on my mind recently. And I actually had a conversation about this with a very close family member the other day. The Jewish family, the Jewish nation, because in essence we are a religion and a nation and a family all wrapped up into one, is famous for its arguments. We even made a whole book out of them. It's called the Talmud. And we argue a lot. And the whole question of the argument is it a productive argument or is it a non-productive argument? Is it an argument about trying to get to the truth, or is it an argument about egos and, honor and all sorts of pettiness? The arguments of the Jewish family are all of the above. We have arguments such as Korach. We have arguments that are good arguments, as we mentioned. Within the story of Korach, there were those that were more petty, there were those that were less petty. We have stories in our tradition here, for example, Tzlafchad, who died for his sins, but yet he is still remembered and his daughters continue. So even though there are people who fall along the wayside, people who maybe are seen in a slightly more negative light, they still are very much within the fold, such as Datan and Aviram. We are constantly bringing and keeping all of the above within the family. Why? Because the Jewish family, is made up of the good and the bad. Beautifully, Chazal say, when we actually have the Ktoret, the special spices that were sacrificed on the altar, the incense that was sacrificed on the internal altar in the Bet Mikdash, one of the things that goes into the recipe for the spices is actually a really bad smelling spice. And the rabbis ask, why is this in there? I thought we're trying to bring nice smelling spices in. And the answer is, by itself, it smells terrible. But when mixed into the mixture of all of the good spices, it actually really enhances the amazing smell of the incense. Say Chazal, similarly, there are bad characters in Jewish history, such as Datan and Aviram. But we need all of the Jews in one big mix in order to succeed and to move forward through Jewish history. Jewish history is very much made up of amazing characters, such as Moshe Rabbeinu, such as Rabbi Akiva, such as Rashi and Maimonides, and all of these amazing leaders and inspirational thinkers and speakers, Herzl and the like. But there are also people who, unfortunately, have left their mark on Jewish history in a negative way. And we sometimes, in the benefit of hindsight, can see how that might have moved the wheels of history, even potentially in a more positive direction. We never know for sure. But characters such as Elisha ben Avuya, such as Spinoza, such as Shabtai Tzvi, all of these characters, some of you might know them more, some of you might know them less. Each one of these Jewish characters has a role to play in Jewish history. The lists include Korach, they include Datan Aviram, they include Ervonan. Jewish history is, with all of its wrinkles, with all of its warts, with all of its ups and with all of its downs. We need to make the list of everyone. Beautifully on Seder night, we have the 4 sons sitting at the table, and we include the Rasha, the evil son. He too needs to be at the Seder table. Without him, the Seder is not complete. How does this connect to today? Well, part of the beautiful thing that the Jewish people is famous for, even in today's day and age, is internal fighting. There are lots of battles going on within Israeli society, between this political faction and that political faction, between this type of socioeconomic background and that type of socioeconomic background, between Ashkenazim and Sfaradim, between the rich and the poor, between people who are more educated, people who are less educated, between the more religious and the less religious. All of these different fractures that go throughout our society, for good and for worse. Some are more of an issue these days, some are less of an issue these days, but they all come back to the same question. Who is in and who is out? Who is someone who does belong and who is someone who doesn't belong? And the beautiful thing that I think we learn from our Parsha is that all of these families belong. We mentioned all of them. And even though we argue, we always argue within the family. And I always like to think, when I'm reading the Parasha, that just like we have Lechetzron Mishpachat Chetzroni, Leperetz Mishpachat Apartzi, Today we have Lechared Mishpachat HaCharedi, Lechilon Mishpachat HaChiloni, Ledat Mishpachat HaDati, and so on and so forth, Lemasoret Mishpachat HaMasorati. Similarly today, in a kind of, it rhymes with the past. I once heard a beautiful statement that says, history doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but it very often rhymes. These names that we keep talking about, the different tribes of the Jewish people today, are all part of one big tribe. We can have very strong arguments with all of them, and we can be very, very vicious and very, very harif and highly opinionated about many of these different arguments and argue very, very, very tenaciously. And yet, we're still on the same list. When we count the Jewish people, all of us, including our biggest opponents, both politically and socially, are all part of the same nation. So with that, I wish you a Shabbat Shalom, and I hope that we use this week to think positively. And remember, even though we have arguments with all sorts of different types, let's try and bring them all into one parasha, one list, and recognize that yes, we will continue our arguments for all time, but at least we're all sitting around the same table. Shabbat Shalom.